ZARINA ട്രസ്റ്റിൻ്റെ രണ്ടാമത്തെ ചിന്താ സായാഹ്നമാണ് ഇന്നിവിടെ സംഘടിപ്പിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളത്. കഴിഞ്ഞ പ്രാവശ്യം നമ്മളെല്ലാവരും ഒത്തുകൂടി കേരളത്തിലെ അടിമകൾ ഉണ്ടായത് എങ്ങനെ എന്നുള്ള വിഷയത്തെക്കുറിച്ചായിരുന്നു ചർച്ച. ഇന്ന് നമുക്കെല്ലാം സുപരിചിതനായിട്ടുള്ള ഇപ്പോൾ ഭാരത ചരിത്ര കോൺഗ്രസിൻ്റെ സാരഥ്യം വഹിക്കുന്ന നമ്മുടെ പ്രിയപ്പെട്ട ഡോക്ടർ കേശവൻ വെളുത്താട്ട് സാറിനെ ഇന്നത്തെ വിഷയമായ ദി ഐഡിയ ഓഫ് ഇന്ത്യ എ ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയൻസ് പെർസ്പെക്റ്റീവ് എന്ന വിഷയത്തിൽ അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് പറയാൻ ഇവിടെ എത്തിയിട്ടുള്ള വെളുത്താട്ട് കേശവൻ സാറിനെ സെറീന ട്രസ്റ്റിന് വേണ്ടി ഹൃദയപൂർവ്വം സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. ഇവിടെ നമ്മോടൊപ്പം ഇതിൻ്റെ റിമോട്ടായി പ്രവർത്തിക്കുന്ന സുധാകരൻ സാറ് ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു ട്രസ്റ്റ് രൂപീകരിക്കാനും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഇങ്ങനെ അവസരം കിട്ടുമ്പോഴൊക്കെ ഇത്തരത്തിലുള്ള ചിന്താ സായാഹ്നങ്ങൾ സംഘടിപ്പിക്കാനും മുതിരുന്നത് വളരെ വളരെ സന്തോഷപ്പെട്ട കാര്യമാണ്. കാരണം ഇതുതന്നെയാണ് ഈ ഒത്തുകൂടൽ എന്നുള്ളത് വളരെ വളരെ നമ്മുടെ ഹൃദയത്തിൻ്റെ അടിത്തട്ടിൽ നിന്ന് നമുക്ക് എന്തൊക്കെയോ നഷ്ടപ്പെട്ടുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത് തിരിച്ചു കിട്ടുന്ന ഒരു സുഖം ഇതിലുണ്ട്. ഏതായാലും ഈ പരിപാടിയിൽ സുധാകരൻ സാർ ഇങ്ങനെയൊരു ഉദ്യമത്തിന് ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത് തുടർന്നും ഉണ്ടാകുമെന്നും അതിന് ജഗദീശ്വരൻ എല്ലാ വിധത്തിലുള്ള ആയുരാരോഗ്യ സൗഖ്യവും സുധാകരൻ സാറിന് തരികയും ഹൃദയപൂർവ്വം സാറിനെ ഈ സദസ്സിലിരിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. സാറിന് എൻ്റെ ഹൃദയംഗമമായ സ്വാഗതം ഓതുന്നു. ഈ ഇന്ത്യ എന്നുള്ള രാജ്യം എങ്ങനെ എന്നുള്ള ആ രാഷ്ട്രത്തിൻ്റെ ചരിത്ര വീക്ഷണം നമുക്ക് ഭംഗിയായിട്ട് പറഞ്ഞു തരും എന്നുള്ള പൂർണ്ണ വിശ്വാസത്തോടു കൂടി എല്ലാവരെയും ഒരിക്കൽ കൂടി സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. വന്ദേ മാതരം.
The idea of India, a historian's perspective. I am extremely grateful to Professor P.P. Sudhakaran, who has been my friend, philosopher and guide in every sense for nearly half a century now, for the singular honor he has done me by asking me to give a talk in memory of Mrs. ZARINA, his late lamented wife. Sudhakaran and I met ZARINA together for the first time in 1978 at a summer institute in the University of Mysore, where all the three of us were participants. Our friendship grew ever since. A Kashmiri from her father's side, a Mysorean Dakhini from her mother's side, and a Malayali from her husband's side, she represented the idea of India better than anybody else. Therefore, I seek to pay my homage to her memory by looking at the idea of India from a historian's standpoint, which is what Sudhakaran has asked me to do. I shall begin by trying to answer the question, what exactly do I mean by the idea of India? Honestly, my answer is that I don't know. I do not know if there is an idea of India at all. To my mind, it appears that several ideas of India are possible, one centering on the nation state being one. Our constitution begins by defining India, that is Bharat, as a union of states, which is perhaps the only legally binding definition. That definition, out and out political, has a heavy historical baggage behind it. It includes the heritage of the national movement. Many forces have contributed to the making of this idea of India, that is Bharat. First of all, there was the rallying of people who realized that they had a common interest against the British rule. This led to the strengthening of the bones of an idea of India and an idea of India emerged and got congealed. I can see many of you are raising your eyebrows with the question, if the idea of India, that is Bharat, is something that got congealed in the modern period, was there no such notion at all in the earlier periods? First of all, we must be clear that our constitution notwithstanding, India and Bharat are not synonyms. The words and ideas having had different trajectories of development. Bharata, the name for India in several Indian languages, is mainly derived from the name of the tribe of Bharatas who are mentioned in the Rig Veda as occupying a part of western Punjab, which is now in Pakistan. Later texts claim variously that Bharata is derived from the name of one of the sons of King Dasharatha of Ramayana, from that of the son of Dushyanta of Mahabharata, or yet another Bharata, son of Rishabha, a Jain Tirthankara. The entire corpus of the Vedas, including the Rig Veda, the other Samhitas, and the later Vedic texts, such as the Brahmanas and Upanishads, does not know any geographical unit called Bharata. Gradually, following the eastward expansion of the Vedic people and the settlement of the Indo-Gangetic divide, the Yamuna Ganga Doab and middle and lower Ganga valleys, the whole of northern India came under the cultural hegemony of the people who carried with them the Vedic tradition, of course enriched by local elements. The area which they occupied was described as Aryavarta. Literally, Arya Avartante Yatra, that is, here live the noble ones, and Madhya Desha, the middle land, that is, the land between the Himalayas and the Vindhyan ranges. The Buddha knew this land as such. Interestingly, the Mahabharata, the great epic of India, does not know of a country called Bharata or Mahabharata. Ashoka, the Mauryan ruler, does not use any of these terms to describe his possessions. He uses another expression, Jambudvipa. He knew that the lands of Cholas, Pandyas, Chairas and Satyaputras, which Dr. Sumati was referring to, Keralaputra, as well as Sri Lanka, were neighboring his empire, well outside it. There is no notion of Bharata as indicating a territory in the historical records until the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. Bharata, as the name of a territory, comes into use in the Puranic literature, which was redacted during the time of the Guptas and after. The Puranas have their own geography, which is not exactly at peace with our understanding of geography. It begins with the concept of the earth, which consists of 7 concentric islands, Saptadvipa, around the Mount Meru, which is taken as the axis mundi, each of which is encircled by a sea of salt, sugarcane juice, alcohol, ghee, yogurt, milk, and sweet water, respectively. The central island is known as Jambudvipa. Bharatakhanda is only one of its subdivisions. The land of the Kurus, that of the Vidahas, that of the Kosalas, and so on, are Varshas along with and distinct from Bharatavarsha, which shows that Bharatavarsha of the early sources did not include the whole subcontinent. Conceived as a land bounded by the Himalayas in the north and the sea in the south, it is a later concept. The oft-quoted definition of Bharatavarsha, that is, Uttaram Yat Samudrasya, which Dr. Sumati was quoting, Uttaram Yat Samudrasya, Himadreyasya Iva Dikshinam, Varsham Tad Bharatam Nama, Bharati Yatra Santadi. That is, To the north of the sea and to the south of the Himalayas is the land called Bharata, where live the descendants of Bharata, occurs in the Vishnu Purana, which is from a later period. It is in the post-Gupta period, that is, from the 6th or 7th century CE, that the term came to be used, if in a tenuous manner and in a very restricted context, to denote a territory coterminous with what is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan. It is this idea that fired the imagination of poets in Sanskrit from this period on in the accounts of the conquests of the kings, Digvijayas, and in the construction of a sacred geography with centers of worship for those who practice the worship of Shiva, Vishnu and Shakti. It is this that percolated into vernacular consciousness through this discourse, as we see in romantic literature such as Chandrolsavam in Manipravalam in the 14th century or Pondanam's Jnanapana in the 16th century. The term Bharata came to stay for the land in the Sanskritic Brahmanical discourses. Those outside this discourse, that is, the Sanskritic Brahmanical discourse, however, had no access to it. There is no way we can know how the vast majority of population with no access to literacy and this discourse knew this land, or whether they had any knowledge of anything beyond their immediate neighborhood at all. In any case, the literary tradition of those who were outside it uses other words for this country. It is largely based on a river bordering this country, namely Sindhu, that foreigners gave it a name. The first mention of this river in sources from outside India is arguably in Greek, Indos, from the Achaemenid equivalent of Sindhu, namely Hindush in Persian. Skylax of Karyanda in the 6th century BC is said to have sailed down the Indus at the behest of the Achaemenid Empire Darius I. Herodotus, who is hailed as the father of history, uses the term Indos for the Indus River as well as Indians for the people living in the lower reaches of that river. It was this land that is credited as the eastern extremity of Alexander's expedition. He did not cross the Indus, he returned downstream, which return Vincent Smith describes as this victorious march from the Himalayas to the sea. In any case, India was for them the land on either side of the Indus. The word India is used in Latin. India was known in Old English and was used by King Alfred in the 9th century CE. There were other names by which foreigners knew this land. I have given many examples. I don't want to test your patience. All these, incidentally, are derived from Indus in their respective language. More important, however, is the expression Hindustan, which has had a much longer innings on a stabler wicket. The words Hindu and Hind derived from the Indo-Aryan Sanskrit word Sindhu. The Achaemenid Emperor Darius I conquered the valley of the Indus in about 516, upon which the Achaemenid equivalent of Sindhu, that is Hindush, was used as the lower Indus basin. The name was also known as far as Egypt, an Achaemenid province in the 6th century BCE, where it was written in hieroglyphics as Hindvi. The Middle Persian suffix stan, indicative of a country or region, was added probably from the 1st century CE, forming the name of Hindustan. Thus, Sindh was referred to as Hindustan in the Naksha-Rastam inscription in the year 262. The name Al-Hind occurs in an Umayyad coin minted in India from the time of Muhammad ibn Qasim, who was the first governor of the Caliphal province of Sindh in 715. By the time we come to the 9th and 10th centuries, the name Hindustan had come to stay. Al-Biruni wrote Tariq al-Hind, which is an adulatory treatise on Indian culture. Not only did the sultans of Delhi and the Mughal emperors use the word, but even the Rajput and Maratha rulers did not find any problem using it. Alexander Dow wrote his history of Hindustan. Rennell prepared the map of Hindustan, and during the national movement, Indians referred to their country by all the three names: India, Hindustan, and Bharat. Muhammad Iqbal's Tarana-e-Hindi, that is, anthem of the people of Hind, beginning Sare Jahan se Acha, Hindosita Hamara, was a popular patriotic song among Indian independent activists. It has been adopted as the official quick march song of the Indian Armed Forces. Rakesh Sharma, the first Indian astronaut, used the first line of this tarana in 1984 to tell Prime Minister Indira Gandhi how India appeared from outer space. This discussion will lead to another question. With such long antecedents, how does one say that the notion of India is modern? The problem is that these ideas remained in the discourse of the elites and did not bind people together. In fact, even the elites of the land themselves hardly behaved as if they belonged to one country. The history of India is replete with stories of conquests of one region by another, with wars between one kingdom and another, the one looking upon the other as nothing but an enemy. That being so, it is questionable if ordinary men and women participated in any such tradition as belonging to one nation. They knew that they belonged to so many regions and so many castes, that they spoke so many languages. What they saw and experienced were differences more than similarities. In such a situation, unity of the people on the basis of a shared historical tradition, if any, of which people were not aware in any case, was not possible, not to speak of a nebulous idea of a nation. It was only in the nationalist enterprise that history was appealed to. Ernest Renan, the famous French philologist, has famously said, getting its history wrong is part of being a nation. He who insisted that nation was based on a daily plebiscite wrote that if the essential element of a nation is that all its individuals must have many things in common, they must also forget many things. Nowhere is this truer than in India's quest for nationhood. Jawaharlal Nehru sought to discover India, but that is more an invention than a reality, than a discovery. Even professional historians like Radha Kumud Mukherjee, very ardently indulged in this exercise of historicizing a new idea. In short, the idea of India was something which was conjured up during the national movement in the 19th and 20th centuries for purposes of rallying the Indian people against the British, with appeals to history and a non-existent common cultural heritage. In such a situation, do I mean to say that the people of India joined together with the purpose of fighting the foreign rule as they belonged to one nation? No, I do not mean that way. In the first place, it is questionable if people of this country had a conscious, articulated awareness that they were one nation, or even that the idea of nationhood was present at all. Secondly, they did not oppose the British rule because it was foreign rule. The opposition was against its exploitative character. Early nationalist leaders like Dadabhai Nauroji, Ramesh Chandra Dutt and others had recognized and emphasized this. They went on swearing their loyalty to the legally constituted authority. Nauroji said, I quote, "Let us speak out like men and proclaim that we are loyal to the backbone." At the same time, as we know, Nauroji had in his book titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India brought out, with the help of unimpeachable statistics, that considerable wealth had been siphoned out of India. The magnitude of the drain of wealth from India was shown as 8% of India's national income, at a time when only 4% of Britain's national income was invested in industrial revolution, and we are talking about the period of industrial revolution. They showed how India was being bled white and exposed to the exploitative character of colonialism. Early nationalist leaders did not organize mass movements against the British. Theirs was an ideological struggle. That will raise the question, was it just an ideological debate and a struggle based on opposition to the economic contradictions of the British Raj? Not really. To begin with, it was educated Indians, members of the emerging middle class, who gave voice to this opposition. There could have been no national struggle without an ideological struggle clarifying the concept of we as a nation against colonialism as an enemy. They had to find answers to many questions such as, was Britain ruling India for India's benefit or their own? Were the interests of the rulers and the ruled in harmony, or did a basic contradiction exist between the two? Was the opposition of the Indian people with the British bureaucrats in India, or with the British government, or with the system of colonialism? Were the Indian people capable of fighting the mighty British Empire? And how was the fight to be carried out? The early leaders hoped sincerely that the British will behave the British way, that is, in a decent, civilized way. Hence, Nauroji's book, the title of Nauroji's book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. They adopted constitutional means such as petitions, memoranda, speeches, public meetings, and press campaigns. However, there was one section among them who were not as convinced. They, known as extremists in the history of early Indian national movement, ridiculed the former as so many political mendicants. They advocated more direct struggle. Tilak was clear, Swaraj is my birthright and I will have it. It was when Mahatma Gandhi catapulted himself into the movement and assumed its leadership in the 1920s, that the movement acquired a mass character with a large number of people from all parts of the country, from all walks of life, from all castes and creeds, joining the movement. It really became a mass movement. The Indian national movement became, I quote Bipin Chandra, undoubtedly one of the biggest mass movements that modern history has seen, a movement which galvanized millions of people of all classes and ideologies into political action and brought to its knees a mighty colonial empire. At this point, a question may raise itself. If there was no consciousness of an Indian nation, under which banner did the people of India gather? We must understand that nation is a modern notion, a modern category. Pre-modern world did not know about it. Various factors went into the making of the idea of an Indian nation. Factors such as easier transport and communication, growth of the printing press, enabling propagation of literature of different varieties, a closer understanding of the past through Orientalist and historical studies, and so on. It was close to what Benedict Anderson would call an imagined community. But more importantly, it was by recognizing the exploitative character of colonialism and making people aware of it that early leaders were able to promote a feeling of oneness among them. India had just entered the process of becoming a nation or a people. The first major objective of early leaders of Indian national movement was to accelerate this process of welding Indians into a nation, creating an Indian people. The Congress leaders recognized that objective historical forces were bringing the Indian people together. Leaders from Dadabhai Nauroji, Surendranath Banerjee and Lokmanya Tilak to Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru accepted that India was not yet a fully structured nation, that it was a nation in the making. In fact, the title of Surendranath Banerjee's autobiography is A Nation in the Making. One of the major objectives and functions of the national movement was to promote the growing unity of the Indian people through the common struggle against colonialism. In other words, the national movement is to be seen both as a product of the process of the nation making and as one of its active agents. This process of nation making was never counterposed to the diverse regional, linguistic, and ethnic diversities in India. On the contrary, the emergence of a national identity and the flowering of other narrower identities were complementary, each deriving strength from the other. Pre-nationalist resistance to colonial rule, including the one of 1857, failed to understand the twin phenomena of the exploitative character of colonialism and the importance of national unity to oppose it. They had to be accessed, that is, the exploitative character, they had to be accessed through hard analysis. Early leaders like Dadabhai Nauroji, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, G.V. Joshi, and others made this analysis, and based on it, intellectuals who played a significant role in arousing the inherent, instinctive, nascent anti-colonialist sentiments of the people conscientized them about it. As far as my knowledge goes, the first articulation of the notion of an Indian nation is to be seen in the name of the organization Indian National Congress. The forging and promotion of national unity was a major objective of the Indian National Congress and its major achievement. The question still remains, how far did an organization founded and led by the elites of the country, a microscopic minority as the British ridiculed early Congress organization, a microscopic minority, succeed in this aim of making a nation of heterogeneous people with little in common? Modern politics, the politics of popular participation, agitation, and mobilization, was new to India. Indian people had no notion that politics was not the preserve of the few, but the domain of everyone. No modern political movement was possible till people realized this. And then, on the basis of the realization, an informed and determined political opinion had to be created. The arousal, training, organization, and consolidation of public opinion was seen as a major task by the early leaders. How was it possible for the Congress, which met only once in a year and in different parts of the country, to achieve this? It is wrong to believe that the activities of Congress was confined to its annual meetings and the resolutions adopted in these meetings. The Congress opposed various unacceptable laws which the state had passed from time to time in different ways. From the beginning, it was conceived not as a party but as a movement. It also did not try to limit its following to any social class or group. As a movement, it incorporated different political trends, ideologies, and social classes and groups, so long as the commitment of democratic secular nationalism was there, were incorporated. From the outset, the Congress included in its ranks the leadership, in the ranks of its leadership, persons with diverse political thinking, widely disparate levels of political militancy, and varying economic approaches. True, in the period from 1817 to 1918, the national movement had not resorted to mass agitation, nor did political work consist of active mobilization of people in mass struggles. The main task still was that of politicization of the people. In mass politicization of the people, political propaganda and education, and formation and propagation of a nationalist ideology. The press was the chief instrument for carrying out this task. That is, for arousing, training, mobilizing, and consolidating nationalist public opinion. Pamphleteering was a major strategy of propaganda. Even the work of the National Congress was accomplished during these years largely through the press in various ways. The Congress had no organization of its own for carrying on political work. Its resolutions and proceedings had to be propagated through the newspapers. Interestingly, nearly 1/3 of the founding fathers of the Congress in 1885 were journalists. Powerful newspapers emerged during these years under distinguished and fearless journalists. I have given a list. The influence of the press extended far beyond the literate subscribers. Nor was it confined to cities and large towns. A newspaper would reach remote villages and would then be read by a reader to tens of others. Gradually, library movements sprung up all over the country. A local library would be organized around a single newspaper. A table, a bench or two, a charpoy would constitute the capital equipment of that library. Every piece of news or editorial comment would be read or heard and thoroughly discussed. The newspaper not only became a political educator, reading or discussing it became a forum for political participation. What Jürgen Habermas describes as the public sphere was gradually emerging in India. Propaganda through the press was extremely effective. The authorities felt threatened. Naturally, many laws curtailing the freedom of the press were passed, which helped the press to become more and more anti-imperialist and nationalist. A people with a clear consciousness of civil liberties resulted from the entire movement. So, was the national movement confined to the political in its programs and agenda? Certainly not. The social background of Indian nationalist movement is perhaps as important as the economic critique of colonialism and the conscientization of people about the contradictions of colonialism. Raja Ram Mohan Roy had, as early as 1828, recognized the fact that some change should take place in their religion, at least for the sake of their political advantage and social comfort. The spirit of reform embraced almost the whole of India. Nearly every part of the country and every caste and religion had an organization aimed at social reform. Despite being regional in scope and content and confined to particular religions or castes, their general perspectives were remarkably similar. There were manifestations of a common consciousness. Although the ambit of reforms was particularistic, their religious perspective was universalistic. Questions of sati, child marriage, the conditions of widows who were spared satihood, and many other outrageous systems had made the life of women miserable. They were not given any education. Most of these movements had the improvement of the condition of the status of women in their agenda. This was pursued not as a purely humanitarian measure. They knew that no reform could be really effective without changes in domestic conditions, the social space in which the initial socialization of the individual took place. Since women played a crucial role in this place, there could be no reformed homes and reformed men without reformed women. It was indeed a limited perspective when viewed from the standpoint of women. It was realized that no country could ever make significant progress in civilization whose females were sunk in ignorance. Thus, the values of what has been described as the Indian Renaissance contributed richly to the idea of India. Did these attempts at social reform reject a tradition in favor of what is perceived as its opposite, namely modernity? Not at all. If the reform movements had totally rejected tradition, Indian society might have been different. The reformers were aiming at modernization of tradition rather than its rejection. A blind imitation of Western cultural norms was not part of the agenda of reform. Faced with the challenge of intrusion of colonial culture and ideology, attempts were made to reinvigorate traditional institutions and realize the potential of traditional culture during the 19th century. In fact, it was in the realm of religion, of culture, that the initial expression of the struggle against colonial domination manifested itself. This concern covered the entire existence, the way of life, and all signifying practices like language, religion, art, and philosophy. Two features characterize this concern: the creation of an alternative cultural ideological system and the regeneration of traditional institutions, the cultivation of regional languages, and attempts to produce new genre of literature, such as the novel in them, the creation of an alternative system of education, the efforts to regenerate Indian art and literature, the emphasis of medicine, the attempts to probe to the potentialities of pre-colonial technology and to reconstruct traditional knowledge were some of the expressions of this concern. A more definite articulation of this was in the ideas and activities of later movements, generally characterized as conservative and revivalist. Strongly native tendency, they were clearly influenced by the need to defend indigenous culture against colonial cultural hegemony. In this sense, they were not necessarily retrogressive. For underlying these efforts was the concern with the revival of the cultural personality that was distorted, if not destroyed, by colonial domination, particularly because they constituted an integral element in the formation of national consciousness. However, some of these tendencies were not able to transcend the limits of historical necessity and led to a sectarian and obscurantist outlook. This was a result of the poor integration between the cultural and political struggles, which unfortunately led to cultural backwardness in spite of considerable political advance. I shall presently return to this aspect of the socio-cultural movements. Suffice it to say here that the cultural ideological struggle represented by the socio-religious movements was integral of the evolving national consciousness. This was so because it was instrumental in bringing about the initial intellectual and cultural break, which made a new vision of the future possible. Second, it was part of the resistance against colonial cultural and ideological hegemony. Out of this dual struggle evolved the modern cultural situation, that is, new men, new homes, and a new society. In all these matters, the national movement was still in the hands of the elite. When did it actually involve the masses so that it represented a larger idea of India? I should like to believe that the involvement of the masses in the national movement did not occur as a sudden transformation of its character. Its leaders were trying, certainly from the 1880s, to reach out to the masses through the press, publishing articles and other pieces, capable of creating public opinion by different means. These included speeches in public meetings and their reports in the press, speeches in the legislature, widely publicized in the press, the pamphlets, door-to-door campaign, and so on. Following the partition of Bengal, the agitation became so widespread that it almost acquired a mass character, if not grew into an all-India movement. The Swadeshi and boycott movements launched in its wake had a similar mass base. Slowly but surely, it began reaching out to the masses. Mahatma Gandhi seized the opportunity and made use of it during the Khilafat and non-cooperation movements. Indian nationalism had graduated as a mass movement, and with it, the idea of India got deeply impressed on the minds of the masses. What was the appeal of the national movement to the masses? Was it simply as a political movement to gain freedom from foreign rule? No, it was not. The masses were conscientized about their misery and made to realize that the exploitative colonial state was at its root. Peasant discontent, for example, against established authority was a familiar feature of the 19th century. Early nationalists were aware of this. Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote in the Kesari as early as 1897, I quote, "The country's emancipation can only be achieved by removing the clouds of lethargy and indifference which have been hanging over the peasant, who is the soul of India. We must completely identify ourselves with the peasant." Unquote. Organized peasant movements had not taken place in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, movements that emerged out of this content had a new feature. They were influenced by, and in their turn, had a marked influence on the ongoing struggle for national freedom. The nature of this relationship was complex, as in the stories of the peasant struggles that emerged in the second and third decades of the 20th century, such as the Kisan Sabha and Eka movement in Awadh and UP, the Mapla rebellion in Malabar, and the Bardoli Satyagraha in Gujarat. Agitations against the high-handed behavior of landlords took the hue of a nationalist struggle, for they too were informed by an anti-colonial ideology. And since nationalism, as Jawaharlal Nehru said, is an anti-feeling, this further strengthened the national consciousness. This is the story of working class participating in the process of making the nation similar to that of the peasant. The modern worker makes his appearance in India in the second half of the 19th century. Disparate groups of workers in various parts of the country emerging as an organized, self-conscious, all-India class is inextricably linked to the growth of Indian national movement and the process of the nation in the making. Before the Indian nationalist leaders began to associate themselves with working class agitations towards the end of the 19th century, there were several sporadic, unorganized revolts on immediate economic grievances, including strikes by workers in the textile mills of Bombay, Calcutta, Ahmedabad, Surat, Madras, Coimbatore, Wardha, and so on, in the railways and in the plantations. However, they hardly had any wider political implication. Organizations to improve the working conditions of the labor came up gradually in Bengal, Bombay, and other places, and even a bill seeking to limit the working hours of laborers was introduced in the Bombay legislature in 1878, which was of course defeated. Mass petitions seeking reforms were submitted. With the national movement gaining in strength, efforts were made to organize labor and secure for it a better bargaining position vis-a-vis the more powerful classes in the common anti-imperialist front. Indian National Congress, and the nationalist newspapers worked hard to get better conditions for workers in the tea plantations in Assam. The Swadeshi upsurge of 1903-8 was a distinct landmark in the history of labor movement. The number of strikes rose sharply, and many Swadeshi leaders enthusiastically threw themselves into the tasks of organizing stable trade unions, strikes, legal aid, and fund collection drives. The greatest success of leaders at this point, both in setting up workers organizations and garnering popular support, was among the workers in the Congress, in the government press, railways, and jute industry. Significantly, all areas in which either foreign capital or the colonial state held sway. Perhaps the most important feature of the labor movement during the Swadeshi days was the shift from agitations and struggles purely on economic questions to the involvement of the worker with the wider political issues of the day. To what extent did this process of making the nation go beyond the freedom movement? Yes, it did. The constructive program of Mahatma Gandhi had a major role to play in this. It included communal unity, removal of untouchability, prohibition, promotion of khadi and other village industries, rural sanitation, basic education, adult education, emancipation of women, education in health and hygiene, cultivation of provincial languages, and promotion of national languages, especially economic equality, taking up the cause of the peasant and labor, the questions of tribals, leprosy patients, and students. Whenever there was a lull in political activity, as for example, following the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement following Chauri Chaura incident, Mahatma Gandhi and his followers took actively to a constructive program which not only kept the fire of nationalism burning but also contributed considerably to making India a nation. It is true that the Dalits rightly felt that the patronizing attitude of the Gandhian variety of constructive program was degrading, and that such programs did not deliver the goods in any case. In spite of these minor detractors, the constructive program contributed immensely to the creation of an inclusive idea of India, apart from keeping the national movement alive when it was at a very low ebb. Were there also factors which hindered the process of nation making? Unfortunately, yes. One major factor which has been standing in its way is communalism of both the majority and the minority communities. As I was saying, in the context of socio-religious movements, which were so crucial in making India a nation, there was an obscurantist, backward looking element in it. This fueled, if inadvertently, the growth of communalism. It should be remembered that there was hardly any communalism in India before the last quarter of the 19th century. As is well known, Hindus and Muslims had fought shoulder to shoulder in the revolt of 1857. The notion of Hindu-Muslim distinction at a non-religious plane, not to speak of clash of interests of Hindus and Muslims, was by and large not visible in the press either during the 1860s. The identity that North Indian newspapers emphasized was that of Hindustanis, especially vis-a-vis European or British rulers. But a false consciousness descended on the people gradually, which made them believe that not only did those who professed one religion belong to one community, but also that they shared common social, economic and political interests which were necessarily opposed to the ones of those belonged to the other community. To begin with, it was all generally soft. The soft communalists basically believed in and practiced communal politics, but they still upheld certain liberal, democratic, humanist and nationalist values, even while holding that India consisted of distinct religion-based communities with their own separate and special interests, which sometimes came into conflict with each other. They continued to believe and profess publicly that these communal interests could be gradually accommodated and brought into harmony within the overall developing national interest, and that India could be built as a nation. Many early nationalist leaders had belonged to this category of soft communalists. At a later stage, however, communalism became extreme. It was based on fear and hatred of the other community and had a tendency to use violence of language, deed or behavior, the language of war and enmity against opponents. Bal Gangadhar Tilak before 1907, the Ali brothers after 1925, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Madan Mohan Malaviya, Lajpat Rai, N.C. Kelkar after 1920 had functioned within such an extreme communal framework. It was at this stage that Muslim communalists declared that Muslim culture and Islam were in danger of being suppressed and exterminated. Hindu communalists too repeated that Hindu culture and Hinduism were in danger. It was also at this stage that both Muslim and Hindu communalists put forward the theory that Muslims and Hindus constituted separate nations whose mutual antagonism was permanent and irresolvable. The Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha after 1937 increasingly veered towards extreme communalism, and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, was extremely communalist from its inception. The colonial state supported communalism for two reasons. The communalists were very loyal to the British, and the masters took advantage of the opportunity to divide and rule. As such, a solution to the communal problem was not easily possible while the colonial state remained. Though, of course, the overthrow of the colonial state was only a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a successful struggle against communism, and the national movement failed to check its growth. The movement ended up dismally in the partition of the country. Even more unfortunate was that India, the putative nation that was saved, could not free itself from the spread of the infection of communalism. This, in spite of the fact that India managed to save a secular constitution while Pakistan chose the religious road. Speaking about the constitution, to what extent is it a statement of the arrival of the nation? Can it be described as completing the idea of India? The constitution was, of course, conceived on Western models, taking elements from many existing states in the West. But its spirit was informed by the historical experience of India. It is not true that it is an expansion and modification of the provisions of the Government of India Act of 1935. Sneers to the contrary notwithstanding. What the founding fathers produced was a genuine statement of a new India, of the new nation's confidence and aspirations. The Indian nationalist movement had achieved the termination of the British rule, but the hard task of reconstruction of an economy and society that lay prostrate following nearly 2 centuries of colonial exploitation was staring at the leaders. It is this spirit of India's social and economic reconstruction which permeates the Constitution. Its visions of national and humane progress, its plans for social and economic justice, and its charters of hope were rooted as much in its experience as in its confidence to surmount it. Rather than getting marooned in the past, the architects of the Constitution critically engaged with the past and produced a robust document, a plan for a new India, a new idea. So, does it mean that the idea of India is an exclusively modern construct with no historical roots at all? It may sound blasphemous, but the reality is that the idea of India is a modern construct which has been sought to be historicized. Historical roots are not out there, they have to be constructed. A particular construction of history is invoked in trying to see the idea of something which has its roots in the past, all through unchanged. The entire enterprise is opposed to canons of historical method. The idea of India that Mukherjee and his ilk seeks to historicize is exclusively from the upper caste Hindu sources such as the Vedas and Puranas. Naturally, it is an idea created of them, by them, for them, the Gettysburg way. It is clearly exclusive. It excludes the Dalits and Adivasis, not to speak of a major chunk of population professing other faiths. But those who sought to historicize India used this indiscriminately. My point is this: the idea of India is a very modern one. That it is of modern origin does not, however, mean that it is any less important, that it is bad. It is extremely crucial that we have to safeguard this idea at all costs, resist all attempts to manipulate and appropriate it by certain sections. We must also be ready to recognize and come to grips with attempts to create multiple ideas of India, negotiating with them, accepting them where necessary, and making adjustments in our own understanding of the idea of India. Thank you.
Now, if anybody is interested in asking questions, this is the time to ask questions. My first question is, Gandhiji's view of idea of India was a civilizational unity, which was unspeakably damaged by the partition. And Nehru's view of India was quite different. He was view of coordinating democratic values, religious tolerance, and communal harmony. So your comments on this.
Thank you, Professor Padmanabhan, for your nice words. Gandhi's civilizational approach, first articulated in his classic Hind Swaraj, perhaps the thinnest book, but which is the heaviest book that he has written. Hardly 60 pages, but the heaviest book that he has written. In this, he articulates this, and I am reminded of a very interesting conversation that a journalist had with Gandhi when he went to London for the Round Table Conference. And the second Round Table Conference, a British journalist went up to him and told him, Mr. Gandhi, I have read your Hind Swaraj. I was very impressed by this. By the way, tell me, what is your opinion about modern civilization? Gandhi's answer was that, yes, it should be a good idea. Modern civilization should be a good idea. That is what Gandhi said. So Gandhi's idea of civilization, if you read Hind Swaraj, you can very clearly see what Gandhi means by that. And for Gandhi, the kind of civilization that he had in mind was not the kind of civilization that the Orientalists and Indologists had constructed. For him, the entire spectrum of Indian population should be included in that. So the Bhangis, the Dalits, the Adivasis, all these included in that. And that is why Gandhi was unacceptable for many others when they are talking about nationalism, etc. Nehru's idea, I had casually referred to his discovery of India as an invention of India. It is mostly trying to historicize an Indian nation through imagining a particular kind of past for India, and for this using all sorts of constructs that are available largely in the imperialist kind of historiography. So Nehru's idea of India, as we gather from his historical writing, is a very flippant kind of idea. On the other hand, when it comes to practical mobilization of people, particularly in the 30s, when he was touring the villages of Uttar Pradesh, organizing peasants, etc., he was coming to grips with the reality of India. And this coming to grips with the reality of India made him conscious of the fact that the idea of India really is not what Ashoka and what H.G. Wells has to say about Ashoka, but it is in the people who are the toiling masses. It is this that fired the imagination of Nehru in charting a blueprint for India in the years to come. That can be very, very clearly seen in the policies that he had presided over in the post-independence period.
You told that idea of India is just modern. But at the same time, from the cultural root, can we strengthen our modern concept of idea of India? Thank you.
ഈ ഇന്ത്യ എന്ന ആശയം വളരെ പുതുതായിട്ടുണ്ടായി തീർന്ന ഒരു ആശയമാണ് എന്നുള്ളതുകൊണ്ട് ഇത് ഒരു മോശപ്പെട്ട ആശയമാണ് എന്നും പറയാൻ പറ്റില്ല. വളരെ വളരെ നല്ല വളരെ മഹത്തായിട്ടുള്ളൊരു ആശയമാണ്. മാത്രമല്ല നമ്മുടെ സാംസ്കാരിക ധാരകളെ ഒക്കെ സമന്വയിപ്പിച്ചിട്ട് ഈ ആശയത്തിനെ ശക്തിപ്പെടുത്തേണ്ടത് ആവശ്യമാണ്. പക്ഷേ ഒരു ബുദ്ധിമുട്ട് വരുന്നതെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ഈ സാംസ്കാരിക ധാരകൾ എന്ന് നമ്മൾ പറയാൻ തുടങ്ങുമ്പോഴേക്ക് വേദങ്ങളും ഇതിഹാസങ്ങളും പുരാണങ്ങളും സംസ്കൃത സാഹിത്യവും കഥകളിയും കൂടിയാട്ടവും ഒക്കെ കൂടിയായിട്ട് ഈ അപ്പർ കാസ്റ്റ് ഹിന്ദു കൾച്ചറൽ ട്രഡീഷൻ മാത്രം ആയി പോവുകയാണ്. ഈ വേലകളിയും കന്യാർകളിയും അതേപോലെ തന്നെ ദളിതൻ്റെയും ആദിവാസികളുടെയും കളിയും ഒക്കെ അതൊക്കെ കൾച്ചറിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമാണ്. ഈ ഹൈ കൾച്ചർ പോപ്പുലർ കൾച്ചർ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ആർട്ടിഫിഷ്യൽ ഡിവിഷൻ ഉണ്ടല്ലോ, ഈ ഡിവിഷൻ്റെ ഉള്ളിൽ വെച്ചിട്ടുള്ള ഇതിൽ ഈ ഹൈ കൾച്ചറിന് മാത്രമാണ് കൾച്ചർ എന്നുള്ള പേര്. നമ്മൾ ഈ വീടിൻ്റെ സിറ്റിംഗ് റൂമിൽ ഷോക്കേസിൻ്റെ ഉള്ളിൽ വെക്കണ സാധനങ്ങളുണ്ടല്ലോ, അതൊക്കെയാണ് കൾച്ചർ. അല്ലാണ്ട് നമ്മൾ വടക്കോർത്ത് നമ്മൾ വലിച്ചെറിയണ തരത്തിലുള്ള ചട്ടിപ്പൊട്ടുകൾ അതൊന്നും കൾച്ചറല്ല. അതൊക്കെയും ഇത്ര തന്നെ പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട കൾച്ചറിൻ്റെ ആസ്പെക്റ്റ് ആണെന്ന് മനസ്സിലാക്കിയാൽ നമ്മുടെ ഐഡിയ ഓഫ് ഇന്ത്യ എന്നുള്ളതിന് ഒന്നുകൂടി ശക്തി കിട്ടും എന്നുള്ളൊരു അഭിപ്രായം കൂടി എനിക്ക്.
Ambedkar is neglected. Has he not contributed to the making of India? And what, in fact, the statements made by, the discussions made between Gandhi and Ambedkar has contributed a lot of things to Gandhi to change his views. So I think the reformist method and all that inside the caste, has it not contributed a lot? Why it is being neglected? Seldom it is seen that the historians speak less about him. I mean,
I agree entirely with the statement that Ambedkar has contributed considerably, particularly in the modern period, to the making of the notion, the idea of the nation. Why historians have neglected him is a question perhaps I will not be able to answer, because I cannot say why X, Y, or Z have ignored that. In my own understanding, in fact, when I spoke about the Constitution, the architects of the Constitution, when I spoke about the architects of the Constitution, what I had in mind was precisely the mastermind behind the Constitution. Not only the Constitution, right from 1930s, 1935 onwards to be precise, the way in which Ambedkar contributed, and perhaps by providing the tractors to the progress of the national movement, that is immense. Now you cannot underestimate, you cannot overestimate the role of Ambedkar. It is so much. But thank you very much for raising this question.
If the idea of India has been so far the idea of the kings, the monarchs, the rulers, or the nationalist leaders, there were also a lot of last heroes who was not part of the nationalist movement, or perhaps even the idea of a history from below. So if my question largely is the idea of India an idea of history from below, or is it a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach?
Those who identify themselves as subaltern historian, they do not subscribe to an idea of a center at all. For them, it is so many sporadic movements. There is no hegemony. There is no overarching thing. For them, there is no idea of India at all. So, if you are speaking about the subaltern studies collective, I should believe that it's a contradictory position. On the other hand, what you had in mind is about the way in which people of the other sections, which are not part of the hegemonic, for example, Indian National Congress was there, but outside of the Indian National Congress, there were a large number of minor groups. There were developments which fell outside the agenda of, which also contributed to the answer. If that is the question that you have, my answer is yes, we have to incorporate that also as ultimately constituting the idea of India. That is why I said that we cannot just put it down to a single organization or a single event. Thank you.
We had the European history concentrating on Christendom in the sense that one religion could be a binding factor. Now the question is, can religion be a binding factor at all in terms of history? Particularly today, when you talk about Israel and Hamas and so on, does it pull its weight? Has it any role to play at all, except a negative one? The second is perhaps you could expand on the idea of Tagore's nationalism, Tagore's idea of nationalism, how it was not in tune with the general concept of nationalism, even as propagated by the Mahatma. 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Unni. And that's a very, very good question. And the way in which a person complements a question as a good question is a way of saying that I don't have an answer for that. But religion as a unifying factor is more imaginary than real. As a student of history who has read some European history, I have seen more differences on account of Christianity than binding on account of Christianity. The kind of religious wars, the kind of problems that they had because of Christianity. Now, in fact, I had quoted in my speech about you will have to forget many things. Ernest Renan said that if you have to have common things, you will also have to forget many things. And among those things that he said is that we will have to forget the religious world where Christians fought Christians. So, the reality being that in the context of India also, do we have Hindus until about 1950s? We don't have Hindus. We have Nayars, we have this caste, that caste, each one of which was at loggerheads with the other. Now, with this kind of a situation, religious is more an imaginary factor than a real factor. Of course, you can say that we can invoke religion for this. Now, that is why I was saying that a false consciousness descended on people. In the name of religion, a false consciousness was created. This is precisely what is happening in Israel, where Israel and Palestine, Hamas is only an organization. It's actually Israel's high-handedness which is happening in Palestine, the proverbial Arab and the camel story. The Palestinian Arab and the camel of Israel. This is what is happening there. This is precisely what is happening, and this is precisely what is happening all around us. About the second part of it, subtle differences in the understanding of nationalism between that of Nehru and Tagore, yes. But my question, that is the question that I was trying to address here, was how the nationalist movement helped in welding together, in forging an idea of India. How this idea of India was forged as a result of this process of nation in the making. So to that extent, these subtle differences were irrelevant to my topic. Thank you very much.
ZARINA ട്രസ്റ്റിൻ്റെ മൂന്നാമത്തെ പ്രഭാഷണമാണ് ഇവിടെ നടന്നിട്ടുള്ളത്. ഇതിലൊന്ന് ഓൺലൈനിൽ നിങ്ങൾ കേട്ടിട്ടിരിക്കും. അത് ബാംഗ്ലൂർ വെച്ചാണ് മാധവ് ഗാഡ്കിൽ ചെയ്തത്. മൂന്നാമത്തെ ടോക്ക് അളകാപുരിയിൽ തന്നെ ഇപ്പോൾ നടന്നിരിക്കുകയാണ്. ഈ പ്രഭാഷണത്തിന് എത്തിയിട്ടുള്ള ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട ഡോക്ടർ കേശവൻ വെളുത്താട്ടിന് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ സുദീർഘമായ ഈ ടോക്കിന് നമ്മുടെ എല്ലാവരുടെയും പേരിൽ, ട്രസ്റ്റിൻ്റെ പേരിലും ഞാൻ ആത്മമായ നന്ദി രേഖപ്പെടുത്തുകയാണ്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഇവിടെ ഇന്നത്തെ പ്രഭാഷണത്തിൻ്റെ ശ്രോതാക്കളായി എത്തിപ്പെട്ട എല്ലാ മാന്യ വ്യക്തികൾക്കും ഇവിടെ നടന്ന ചർച്ചയിൽ പങ്കെടുത്ത എല്ലാ മാന്യ സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾക്കും ഈ ട്രസ്റ്റിൻ്റെ പേരിൽ നിങ്ങളുടെ എല്ലാവരുടെയും പേരിൽ ഞാൻ പ്രത്യേകം നന്ദി രേഖപ്പെടുത്തിക്കൊള്ളുന്നു.